Hello, hello, hello. Hello. It's Jane Austen Book Club. That was a mess. I'm very sorry. I kind of started book club before I'd really realised that I was about to start book club and kind of caught myself off guard with having started the stream. So apologies for that. Hello, everyone. Welcome to book club. It's Monday evening. At least in the UK, it's Monday evening. It's Monday-ish time where you are, perhaps. Sorry, I'm just getting up the Discord so that I can see what our lovely mod Drat is saying to me. Yes, everything is looking good for book club. Thank you, Drat. As long as my camera and microphone are good from your end. And nobody's telling me that they're not. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that they are. Hello, 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 everybody. So we are reading Persuasion still. So we have met Anne and her awful family. And Anne is currently staying with her sister Mary. So her sister Mary is married to a man named Charles Musgrove. We know that Charles Musgrove, before he married Mary, had actually proposed to Anne. And Lady Russell was like, he's rich and nice and an heir to a big estate nearby. So Anne will always be there. And she was like, oh, I kind of hope that she says yes. But she didn't. She said no. Probably because she was still hung up on her ex, Captain Wentworth. And so he instead, at a later time, I do not get the impression from the text that this was an immediate transference. No, it can't have been because Mary was at school at the time. No, that's not right. That was when Frederick Wentworth proposed to Anne. Anyway, disregard that. At a later time, he was like, actually, maybe Mary. And Mary was like, yes, I will marry you. And now they're married. And they have some small children, about whom Mary is somewhat indifferent. And they live in a lovely little cottage. Well, it's probably bigger than my house. Definitely bigger than my house. But a lovely house on the grounds of the big manor house that Charles's parents live in. So we've got Charles and Mary Musgrove, and then we've got Mary's in-laws, Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove, and then we've got Charles's sisters, who Mary is like that. That's their sister, her sisters-in-law. So it's kind of also Anne's sisters-in-law. We met them last time, and I believe that they went on a walk. They've got like a slight, what's the right way to characterize their friendship? Like their relationship between Mary and her in-laws. They do get on reasonably well, but it's a little bit fraught. Anne thinks that the Miss Musgroves are delightful people. And they seem to think that Anne's very nice too. Yes, exactly. A cottage. Only 4 beds with a servant's wing. Right. I think there's not much more that we need to know before we start today. So we are staying with the Musgroves. We've met Mary, who's something of a self-obsessed hypochondriac. We have left Sir Walter and Elizabeth, the previous Anne's family that we'd met. They've gone to Bath to start their new life, and Miss Clay has gone with them. Lady Russell is off visiting someone, but it's irrelevant. And the Crofts are set to take possession of Kellynch Hall. They are going to move in to Anne's former home, Kellynch Hall, as tenants. And as we've found out, Anne's love from an earlier time in her life, from like 8 years ago, She had been very briefly engaged to Captain Frederick Wentworth, who, as it turns out, is the brother of Mrs. Croft. And they're big Navy people, because we've got an admiral from the Navy, and then Captain Wentworth is also in the Navy. And he has been away at sea for quite some time, but now the English have won the war, or they're about imminently to win the war against Napoleon, and so we've got a lot of naval officers coming home and settling down at this point, having often made quite a large amount of money. I was going to say a killing, but given that it's a war, that has other connotations. Yes, very good, very good point. Before we get going properly, I should plug the Ko-fi. It's ko-fi.com/Johnny and Sasha. Yes, sorry, British plus allies. It was a big war. There were a lot of nations involved, but these ones are the British ones. I'm sure that other nations had their own naval officers coming home as well. Yes, but we have a Ko-fi, so if you like book club, if you like hearing me read Jane Austen, and if you like the explanations that go along with it, and if you like the, I would say, wonderful community that is in the chat, then you can drop a Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Johnny and Sasha to show your appreciation and to give a comment or a question or something. And I will read it out and be delighted. And then all the money gets put into a big pot, and we split it between the streamers, so in this case me, and the mods, in this case Drut. And if I'm looking over here, that's because that's where my laptop is. So when I'm looking like this, I'm looking at you, chat. Right, are we ready to get started? I think we're ready to get started. There's not that much that's complicated that's happened so far, so I think we're good. If we're familiar with chat eyeline. Yes, Drut does make this community wonderful, for sure. Right, we're up to Volume 1, Chapter... Oh, perfect timing. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome.
Got tea. Right. Oh, hello, little kitten. Have you come to listen to the story? He often comes to listen to the story. Right. Volume 1, Chapter 6. Anne had not wanted this visit to Uppercross to learn that a removal from one set of people to another, though at a distance of only 3 miles, will often include a total change of conversation, opinion, and idea. Just a reminder, Uppercross is the name of the estate where she's currently staying. Uppercross Cottage is Charles and Mary's house, and so that's just saying she was already aware that going even just 3 miles to another set of people will completely change everything that you're talking about and all the vibes. Hello, kitten. Yes, he's just come onto the little footstool that's in front of my chair, so he's just below chat's eyeline at the moment, but I'll try and get him to come more in the screen. She had never been staying there before without being struck by it, or without wishing that other Elliots could have her advantage in seeing how unknown or unconsidered there were the affairs which at Kellynch Hall were treated as of such general publicity and pervading interest. Obviously, Sir Walter and Elizabeth think that their concerns are forefront in everybody's minds. And this is their family, this is their daughter's in-laws, so if they only live 3 miles away, so if they're not talking about them, then that's pretty damning. Yet, with all this experience, she believed she must now submit to feel that another lesson, in the art of knowing our own nothingness beyond our own circle, was become necessary for her. For certainly, coming as she did with a heart... become necessary for her. For certainly, coming as she did with a heart full of the subject which had been completely occupying both houses in Kellynch for many weeks, she had expected rather more curiosity and sympathy than she found in the separate but very similar remarks of Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove. "So, Miss Anne, Sir Walter and your sister are gone, and what part of Bath do you think they will settle in?" And this without much waiting for an answer. Or in the young ladies' edition of, "I hope we shall be in Bath in the winter, but remember, Papa, if we do go, we must be in a good situation. None of your Queen Squares for us." Queen Squares being a very popular part of Bath, although I don't actually know what it was like back in the day. Or in the anxious supplement from Mary of, "Upon my word, I should be pretty well off when you are all gone away to be happy at Bath." That being a kind of ironic thing there. So basically, Anne is also benefiting from the reminder that not everybody is thinking about her all the time, because this move to Bath has been something that's been huge for her, and so she's expecting people to be asking her more about it, but they're just... They make one remark each and that's it. And this with Mary, "Upon my word, I shall be pretty well off when you are all gone away to be happy at Bath," is saying, like, upon my word, like, oh, right, and I'll be fine, I suppose. I'll be, like, just leave me here, I guess. She could only resolve to avoid such self-delusion in future, and think with heightened gratitude of the extraordinary blessing of having one such truly sympathising friend as Lady Russell. The Mr. Musgroves had their own game to guard and to destroy, their own horses, dogs, and newspapers to engage them, and the females were fully occupied in all the other common subjects of housekeeping, neighbours, dress, dancing, and music. She acknowledged it to be very fitting that every little social commonwealth should dictate its own matters of discourse, and hoped ere long to become a not unworthy member of the one she was now transplanted into. With this prospect of spending at least 2 months at Uppercross, it was highly incumbent on her to clothe her imagination, her memory, and all her ideas in as much of Uppercross as possible. So she's just trying to get on board with the vibes, basically. She had no dread of these 2 months. Mary was not so repulsive and unsisterly as Elizabeth, nor so inaccessible to all influence of hers. Neither was there anything among the other component parts of the cottage inimical to comfort. She was always on friendly terms with her brother-in-law, and in the children, who loved her nearly as well, and respected her a great deal more than their mother, she had an object of interest, amusement, and wholesome exertion. Do you ever feel like, I'm sure most of you are coming across this text for the first time, but we're seeing here, like, she was always on friendly terms with her brother-in-law. Like, yes, considering that he asked her to marry him, I'd imagine that that's true. Like, he's probably quite fun. Like, he probably likes and respects her. But she's also very much loved and respected by the children, and it's almost like sometimes it does feel like Mary's family do prefer Anne. I mean, I know that her in-laws prefer Anne. We will see that quite clearly over the course of the book, but even her husband and kids often seem to prefer Anne. Oh, thank you, you've dropped a pic of Queen Square in the Discord. I can check if it is in fact where I think it is. Because after I'd said that, I was like, actually, do you know what? I might have... No, it is where I think it is, yeah. Yeah, cool. Yes, so just to let you know, we do actually have a public Discord for book club. And you can go and check a picture of Queen Square there, if you like. Yeah, I do feel sorry for Mary. Who was it that said that? Yeah. Bookworm on a String. Oh, that's a really good name. Bookworm on a String. Because, yeah, I mean, she must know. When Anne's there, she must see that, like, all of the people around her love Anne so much. Anyway. Charles Musgrove was civil and agreeable. In sense and temper, he was undoubtedly superior to his wife. but not of powers or conversation or grace to make the past, as they were connected together, at all a dangerous contemplation. So basically, he's better than Mary. He's sensible. He's chill, but he's not a danger. He's not attractive. He's not hot, or at least he's not for Anne. Yes, but not of powers or conversation or grace to make the past, as they were connected together, at all a dangerous contemplation. Though, at the same time, Anne could believe, with Lady Russell, that a more equal match might have greatly improved him. So she's thinking she might have been a more equal match. And that a woman of real understanding might have given more consequence to his character, and more usefulness, rationality, and elegance to his habits and pursuits. As it was, he did nothing with much zeal but sport, and his time was otherwise trifled away without benefit from books or anything else. He had very good spirits, which never seemed much affected by his wife's occasional lowness, bore with her unreasonableness sometimes to Anne's admiration, and, upon the whole, though there was very often a little disagreement, in which she had sometimes more share than she had wished, being appealed to in which she had sometimes more share than she wished, being appealed to by both parties, they might pass for a happy couple. They were always perfectly agreed in the want of more money, and a strong inclination for a handsome present from his father. But here, as on most topics, he had the superiority. For while Mary thought it a great shame that such a present was not made, he always contended for his father's having many other uses for his money, and a right to spend it as he liked. As to the management of their children, his theory was much better than his wife's, and his practice not so bad. "I could manage them very well, if it were not for Mary's interference," was what Anne often heard him say, and had a good deal of faith in. But when listening in turn to Mary's reproach of "Charles spoils the children so that I cannot get them into any order," she never had the smallest temptation to say, "Very true." One of the least agreeable circumstances of her residence there was her being treated with too much confidence by all parties, and being too much in the secret of the complaints of each house. Known to have some influence with her sister, she was continually requested, or at least receiving hints to exert it beyond what was practicable. "I wish you could persuade Mary not to be always fancying herself ill," was Charles. Sorry, that's Charles. For some reason, I really remembered that being Mrs. Musgrove. "I wish you could persuade Mary not to be always fancying herself ill," was Charles's language, and in an unhappy mood, thus spoke Mary. "I do believe if Charles were to see me dying, he would not think there was anything the matter with me. I am sure, Anne, if you would, you might persuade him that I really am very ill, a great deal worse than I ever own." Mary's declaration was, "I hate sending the children to the great house, though their grandmamma is always wanting to see them, for she humours and indulges them to such a degree, and gives them so much trash and sweet things, that they are sure to come back sick and cross for the rest of the day." I love this, this particular complaint, their grandmother's always asking me to send them over, but she always just feeds them a load of sugary things and then sends them back all grumpy. That is such a universal complaint. That's just, I love it when you get something from everyday life in a book that's set in a world that is so different from ours, current one, and you get it, and it's that could be written today. I love it. It's one of the reasons why I really like Jane Austen. It's because there is a lot of that. Speaking as an aunt, is that not the job? Well, yeah, from the kid's point of view, that's your job, but the parents are allowed to complain about it. And Mrs. Musgrove took the first opportunity of being alone with Anne to say, "Oh, Anne, I cannot help wishing Mrs. Charles had a little of your method with those children. They are quite different creatures with you. But to be sure, in general, they are so spoilt. It is a pity you cannot put your sister in the way of managing them. They are as fine, healthy children as ever were seen, poor little dears, without partiality. But Mrs. Charles knows no more how they should be treated. Bless me, how troublesome they are sometimes. I assure you, Miss Anne, it prevents my wishing to see them at our house so often as I otherwise should. I believe Mrs. Charles is not quite pleased with my not inviting them oftener, but you know it is very bad to have children with one that one is obliged to be checking every moment. Don't do this and don't do that, or that one can only keep in tolerable order by more cake than is good for them. She had this communication, moreover, from Mary. Mrs. Musgrove thinks all her servants so steady that it would be high treason to call it in question, but I am sure, without exaggeration, that her upper housemaid and laundry maid, instead of being in their business, are gadding about the village all day long. I meet them wherever I go, and I declare I never go twice into my nursery without seeing something of them. If Jemima were not the trustiest, steadiest creature in the world, it would be enough to spoil her, for she tells me they are always tempting her to take a walk with them. And on Mrs. Musgrove's side it was, I make a rule of never interfering in any of my daughter-in-law's concerns, for I know it would not do, but I shall tell you, Miss Anne, because you may be able to set things to rights, that I have no very good opinion of Mrs. Charles's nursery maid. I hear strange stories of her. She is always upon the gad, and from my own knowledge I can declare she is such a fine dressing lady that she is enough to ruin any servant she comes near. Mrs. Charles quite swears by her, I know, but I just give you this hint, that you may be upon the watch, because if you see anything amiss, you need not be afraid of mentioning it. This is an interesting thing here. So obviously, both of these women think that their own servants are brilliant and responsible, and that the other person's servants are trying to corrupt their own. They're getting, like, from their own servants, they're being like, oh yeah, they were like trying to get me out to go for a walk with them and slack off with them, and it may be that they're both sets of servants are slacking off a little bit, just like in a normal way, and then if they get caught, they're like blaming the other ones. Yeah, Karen, like there's two routes here. It can either be that they're both getting on, like, and then they're just like blaming, like they're both slacking, but then they blame the other ones to their own bosses, or that they actually hate each other and they're just constantly trying to dob them in. But this one here, this line, she is such a fine dressing lady that she is enough to ruin any servants she comes near. This was a particular, like, concern at the time, like a social concern, particularly amongst older, more conservative people. Because of the economic situation with fabric and printing and the growth of the fashion industry. Like, fashion industry was basically starting to become an industry. A lot of advertising was kind of invented by the growth of textile manufacturers. So actually, part of my MA is specifically about the textile industry around Lancashire. So I wrote a whole essay on this. There was this push to mass market fashion because suddenly we had cheaper fabrics and a lot of them, and they could be printed in ways that were fashionable, and that had often been like to get a nice pattern on your fabric had previously been tricky. So it was because, like, this was the first time really around the Regency era, a little bit before and a little bit after. Like, it was a long process, but this was like the first time that servants, for instance, could have anything fancy or like fashionable to wear, like could think about fashion. Middle class people could think about fashion in a way that they hadn't been able to, and like upper working class people, like stable working class people could think about fashion in a way they hadn't been able to before. So one of the perks of being in service as well at the same time as this was that you would often get your lady's hand-me-downs clothes wise. So if she was done with a dress, you'd take it, like you'd get it. So that combined with this sudden accessibility of fashion and an increased pace of changing fashions as clothes could be manufactured more quickly, meant that there was this like worry that, well, it wasn't really a big worry for the vast majority of people. It was just kind of like a social commentary, bit of like something to satirize. But the concern, where there was concern, was that, like, oh, suddenly you can't tell who's the lady and who's the maid, you know? Bookworm on a string, yes. Lancashire is also where I'm from, and my MA is specifically like looking at local sources and things, but also because there was a huge textile industry here. Um, Kate B, yeah, yeah, you would be out of luck if the lady you and the lady you worked for were very different sizes. But for one thing, clothing was made to be adjustable because it was meant to last you. So clothing was made with the assumption that it could be adjusted. Um, People were more skilled at adjusting clothes. And also, even if that wasn't the case, clothes fetched a lot of money. Clothes were worth a lot of money, so you could always sell them. Um, there's a thing where, like, for a long time, I haven't seen it so much in wills from this particular time, but wills from like the 18th century, and before, you would have people leaving their servants like a fine jacket in their will, and the assumption then would often be that they would sell it rather than that they would wear it. Mm. Edge dancer, yeah, you could trade with a friend. Um, there are ways to get use out of, if you get a fancy bit of clothing, even if it doesn't fit you. There's absolutely ways to adjust it, or to turn it into something new, or to sell it, or to trade it. It's still worth having, for sure. Joe First of Her Name has subscribed for 15 months. That's amazing. Thank you. Yeah, Karen, I love looking at old clothes and seeing how they've been adjusted, or sometimes just completely made, like, remade, you know? Sorry, I'm just getting back to the correct Discord because I realised I'd gone to the wrong Discord. Right. Oh, goodness, I've got distracted. Where are we? Sorry, I was mentioning about Mrs. Musgrove calling Mary's servant a fine dressing lady, as like a problem. So this is an example of Mrs. Musgrove being concerned and thinking it's not proper for Mary's nursery maid to be in fashion, you know. Right. Again, it was Mary's complaint that Mrs. Musgrove was very apt not to give her the precedence that was her due when they dined at the great house with other families, and she did not see any reason why she was to be considered so much at home as to lose her place. We've talked about this before. The kind of idea of who was given prominence in society was very codified, very formalised, and like where you sat at dinner would be indicative of how respected you were. But here, either Mrs. Musgrove doesn't think that Mary is as high in society as Mary thinks she is, or Mrs. Musgrove thinks that Mary should be a gracious host, even though she doesn't quite live at Uppercross, but she does live at Uppercross Cottage, that she is part of the family, that she should be a gracious host and give someone else precedence. And one day, when Anne was walking with only the Miss Musgroves, one of them, after talking of rank, people of rank, and jealousy of rank, said, "I have no scruple of observing to you how nonsensical some persons are about their place, because all the world knows how easy and indifferent you are about it. But I wish anybody could give Mary a hint that it would be a great deal better if she were not so very tenacious, especially if she would not be always putting herself forward to take place of mamma. Nobody doubts her right to have precedence of mamma, but it would be more becoming in her to not be always insisting on it. It is not that mamma cares about it the least in the world, but I know it is taken notice of by many persons." I think that maybe mamma does care about it a little bit, or it wouldn't be being brought up. How was Anne to set all these matters to rights? She could do little more than listen patiently, soften every grievance, and excuse each to the other. Give them all hints of the forbearance necessary between such near neighbours, and make those hints broadest which were meant for her sister's benefit. In all other respects, her visit began and proceeded very well. Her own spirits improved by change of place and subject, by being removed 3 miles from Kellynch, Mary's ailments lessened by having a constant companion, and their daily intercourse with the other family, since there was neither superior affection, confidence, nor employment in the cottage to be interrupted by it, was rather an advantage. It was certainly carried nearly as far as possible, for they met every morning, and hardly ever spent an evening asunder. But she believed they should not have done so well without the sight of Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove's respectable forms in the usual places, or without the talking, laughing, and singing of their daughters. Oh, we're talking about sewing and repairing clothes. I used to love sewing, but right now I don't have space for it anymore. Ever since I started working from home, what used to be the table where I'd set up my sewing machine, it has become like what used to be the desk, the dining table, and is now the desk. Became, constant desks. So I haven't been able to do it, and I kind of miss it now that we're all talking about it. Yes, I quite like this picture of Uppercross and the families there, and like how well they get on. I think it's really nice. Obviously, Mary is one of those complicated characters in Jane Austen, where I feel like, okay, Jane Austen has a real thing about hypochondriacs. I don't know what's going on there, but it's a thing that just keeps coming up. She is constantly writing in a hypochondriac and being very disrespectful about them. And so I feel like, to me, like, Mary, there's probably something going on with Mary. Like, I don't think she's making it up. So I feel like bad for Mary. I feel like there's probably something unseen going on with Mary. And as someone who has an invisible health condition myself, obviously I find this a bit frustrating, because I'm like, but there's probably something actually wrong with her. Medicine was so bad back then. You didn't know anything. So yeah, I'm often reading this as being like, oh, poor Mary. Like, I'd be grumpy too if I was ill and no one knew why or really seemed to believe me. But in the text, like, Mary does not exist outside of this text. And in the text, she is also a lot. She's also a lot. And she is also, she's not feeling well, but she is also going to make that everybody else's problem. So, yeah, I feel like Mary's quite a complicated one. But aside from that, and aside from the fact that Mary and her in-laws do not get on, or it's not that they don't get on, but it's difficult. They work hard to get on, and it's difficult, and sometimes they don't get on. I actually think this is quite a nice little family life that they have. Yes. But she believed they should not have done so well without the sight of Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove's respectable forms in the usual places, or without the talking, laughing, and singing of their daughters. She played a great deal better than either of the Miss Musgroves, but having no voice, no knowledge of the harp, and no fond parents to sit by and fancy themselves delighted, her performance was little thought of, only out of civility, or to refresh the others, as she was well aware. She knew that when she played she was giving pleasure only to herself, but this was no new sensation. Excepting one short period of her life, she had never, since the age of 14, never since the loss of her dear mother, known the happiness of being listened to, or encouraged by just appreciation or real taste. This excepting one short period of her life is obviously referring to her very brief engagement. So we're seeing through this little reference what her relationship with Captain Wentworth was like. We're seeing that for this short time, he's listening to her. He's got like real taste for music. He's got an ear for it. He understands that she's really good at it and tells her so. In music, she had been always used to feel alone in the world, and Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove's fond partiality for their own daughter's performance, and total indifference to any other person's, gave her much more pleasure for their sakes than mortification for her own. The party at the great house was sometimes increased by other company. The neighbourhood was not large, but the Musgroves were visited by everybody, and had more dinner parties and more callers, more visitors by invitation and by chance than any other family. They were more completely popular. The girls were wild for dancing, and the evenings ended occasionally in an unpremeditated little ball. There was a family of cousins within a walk of Uppercross, in less affluent circumstances, who depended on the Musgroves for all their pleasures. They would come at any time and help play anything, any dance or dance anywhere. And Anne, very much preferring the office of musician to a more active post, played country dances to them by the hour together, a kindness which always recommended her musical powers to the notice of Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove more than anything else, and often drew this compliment: "Well done, Miss Anne, very well done indeed. Lord bless me, how those little fingers of yours fly about." Sorry, just gonna drink my tea. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, she's the youngest, and the youngest with Sir Walter Elliot as a father. Yeah, you must have to get attention somehow, right? We've got a Ko-fi from Moreware, listening while I sew the ends into an enormous crochet blanket. I love book club. Your MA sounds really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Oh, thank you very much for the Ko-fi. Oh, if you have any pictures, please send us some pictures of your enormous crochet blanket. I love an enormous crochet blanket. Oh, yeah, and we've got a Ko-fi. It's ko-fi.com/Johnny and Sasha. And if you like book club, you can subscribe to us on Twitch, or you can drop a Ko-fi, or you can just take a friendly part of your day in the chat. You can just comment in the chat and be active there, but you can subscribe and drop a Ko-fi, and we really like it. Thank you. Nailed it. So passed the first 3 weeks. Michaelmas came, and now Anne's heart must be in Kellynch again. So Michaelmas being the last bit of September, I think 29th of September. A beloved home made over to others. All the precious rooms and furniture, groves and prospects, beginning to own other eyes and other limbs. Sorry, I forgot to say when I was pointing out when Michaelmas was, that is when the Crofts are due to take possession of Kellynch. Like, that's when they're supposed to be moving. So, a beloved home made over to others. All the precious rooms and furniture, groves and prospects, beginning to own other eyes and other limbs. She could not think of much else on the 29th of September, and she had a sympathetic touch in the evening from Mary, who, on having occasion to note down the day of the month, exclaimed, "Dear me, is not this the day the Crofts were to come to Kellynch? I am glad I did not think of it before. How low it makes me." The Crofts took possession with true naval alertness, and were to be visited. Mary deplored the necessity for herself. Nobody knew how much she should suffer. She should put it off as long as she could. But it was not easy till she had talked Charles into driving her over on an early day, and was in a very animated, comfortable state of imaginary agitation when she came back. Anne had very sincerely rejoiced in there being no means of her going. She wished, however, to see the Crofts, and was glad to be within when the visit was returned. So any time that a new member of the gentry moves into the area, You have to pay them a visit, and then they pay you a visit, and then you are acquainted, and you can hang out. They came. The master of the house was not at home, but the two sisters were together, and as it chanced that Mrs. Croft fell to the share of Anne, while the Admiral sat by Mary, and made himself very agreeable with his good-humoured notice of her little boys, she was well able to watch for a likeness, and if it failed her in the features, to catch it in the voice, or the turn of sentiment and expression. So because Mary is talking to Admiral Croft, and he's looking at her kids and that, and saying like, oh, aren't they cute? Very good. Yes, they'll be fine young gentlemen, etc. Mrs. Croft and Anne are talking together, and so she has plenty of opportunity to look for a likeness to Captain Wentworth, who is Mrs. Croft's brother. Mrs. Croft, though neither tall nor fat, had a squareness, uprightness, and vigour of form which gave importance to her person. She had bright, dark eyes, good teeth, and altogether an agreeable face. Though I'm so sorry, but my cat has just crawled into the space where I strongly suspect that Johnny is hiding my birthday presents. And I think he might be having a rummage. Johnny? I think that the cat might be having a rummage in my birthday presents. Oh, never mind, he's got out. He wasn't interested. I think that was really, really good of me, because I could have let him rummage and drag a present out and seen it ahead of time. I could have, but I didn't. I chose to be honest and not take that chance, and I think that's really impressive. The cat is the present now. Thank you. I do have a strong will. I have got a lot of restraint. Yes, it is my birthday on the 4th of March, so in like 4 weeks. But Johnny has been very on it. I think he's actually got all my birthday presents already. Which I don't ever have all of his birthday presents 4 weeks ahead of time. But yeah. Anyway, we're on to Mrs. Croft. Mrs. Croft, though neither tall nor fat, had a squareness, uprightness, and vigour of form which gave importance to her person. She had bright dark eyes, good teeth, and altogether an agreeable face, though her reddened and weather-beaten complexion, the consequence of her having been almost as much at sea as her husband, made her seem to have lived some years longer in the world than her real 38. Her manners were open, easy, and decided, like one who had no distrust of herself, and no doubts of what to do, without any approach to coarseness, however, or any want of good humour. Anne gave her credit indeed for feelings of great consideration towards herself in all that related to Kellynch, and it pleased her, especially as she had satisfied herself in the very first half-minute, in the instant even of introduction, that there was not the smallest symptom of any knowledge or suspicion on Mrs. Croft's side to give a bias of any sort. So basically, she doesn't think that Mrs. Croft knows that Anne was engaged to and then broke the heart of her brother. I love Mrs. Croft. I'm so glad to see people in the chat saying nice things about Mrs. Croft. I love her. It was also so unusual for a woman to go to sea with her husband. It's so cool that she did that. Yes. She was quite easy on that head, and consequently full of strength and courage, till for a moment electrified by Mrs. Croft suddenly saying, "It was you and not your sister, I find, that my brother had the pleasure of being acquainted with when he was in this country." Anne hoped she had outlived the age of blushing, but the age of emotion she certainly had not. "Perhaps you may not have heard that he is married," added Mrs. Croft. She could now answer as she ought, and was happy to feel, when Mrs. Croft's next words explained it to be Mr. Wentworth of whom she spoke, that she had said nothing which might not do for either brother. So, of course, she met Captain Wentworth. We've learned this in a previous chapter. She met Captain Wentworth when he was staying with Mr. Wentworth, who was a curate. So he was a clergyman, and that is who Mrs. Croft was talking about here. Viola Katzen. I wonder how many Regency lesbians had a crush on Mrs. Croft. I would say all of them. All of them, probably. 14 carats. Wasn't it considered bad luck for women to be on boats? I had always believed that it was, yes. But I don't know how true that was. I haven't actually researched that. Just not my area of expertise, I'm afraid. Although I feel like it should be. I feel like my area of expertise should be seagoing culture. I love the sea. Nothing has ever broken my heart as much as finding out that I get horrendous seasickness. Okay, we've got another Kofi from Dante M. Hello, I just came back from a 3-day conference in England, brackets, I live in Ireland, and I'm absolutely exhausted. That is fair. England is exhausting. Thank you for book club. It's the perfect way to relax. Also, I hope this isn't creepy, but I think orange really suits you. Thank you. That's not creepy, I don't think. P.S. Please remember to save the VOD. I will. I remembered to save the last VOD. So if you weren't here last week, we were discussing whether or not these were on YouTube. And I said, well, every time I start a new book, I really intend to save them all and put them onto YouTube. Because it doesn't really work if you've only got like 60% of them on YouTube. You've only got 60% of the book. The rest of it doesn't make any sense. So I am trying to save every single one, import it to YouTube, and keep it private. And then, if I manage to do 6 in a row, I think it's safe to make them public. And so you'll be pleased to know that I am 3 for 3, and I hope to be 4 for 4. Drat, ostensibly the superstition was that women at sea would anger the sea gods and bugger the weather, but I reckon it's more likely that as most sailors were men, women were considered a distraction. Yeah, women probably were considered a distraction, and I suspect that there was also a thing where, like, there was not a lot of reliable contraception, and I can imagine that if you are at sea